For 40 years, nobody in the family talked about that room. Not the grandparents, not the parents, not anyone. And when Sarah finally opened the locked box hidden inside it, she immediately understood why. Because some secrets aren't buried to protect the truth. They're buried to protect the people living with it. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Would you rather know a painful truth or live happily with a beautiful lie? Tell me in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far our family reaches around the world. And if you enjoy emotional stories with powerful lessons and endings that stay with you long after the video ends, subscribe and join us. Now let's continue. Sarah had heard stories about the room her entire life. Not scary stories, not ghost stories, just strange stories. The upstairs room at her grandmother Evelyn's house was always locked. Always. As children, Sarah and her cousins would ask questions. What's inside? Why can't we go in there? And every time, Grandma Evelyn gave the exact same answer. Just old things. Then she would quickly change the subject. At the time, nobody thought much about it. Kids stop asking questions eventually. Life moves on, and it did. Years passed. Children became adults. Families grew. People moved away. Then one quiet morning, everything changed. Grandma Evelyn passed away peacefully at 86 years old. The funeral came and went. Relatives returned home. Life slowly started settling again. Until Sarah received a call from her mother. Grandma left you something. Sarah frowned. Me? What did she leave? Silence. Then her mother said something strange. A key. Sarah stared. A key. Not jewelry. Not money. Not letters. Just one old silver key. And attached to it was a handwritten note. 3 words. Open it now. Sarah felt chills run through her body. Because somehow, deep down, she already knew exactly which door that key belonged to. Sarah stared at the key in her hand. For several seconds. She didn't move. Because suddenly, she didn't feel like a 36-year-old woman anymore. She felt like a little girl again, standing at the bottom of Grandma Evelyn's stairs, looking up at the one room nobody was allowed to enter. Hours later, Sarah stood in front of the old house. The place looked smaller than she remembered. The porch paint had faded. The flowers near the walkway had grown wild. And somehow, everything felt quieter. She stepped inside slowly. The smell was exactly the same. Old books, fresh tea, wood furniture, memories. Her eyes moved upstairs immediately. And there it was. The door. Same dark wood, same brass handle, same mystery. Sarah walked toward it slowly, heart beating harder with every step. Because for 40 years, nobody opened that room. At least, that's what everyone believed. Her hand tightened around the key. Then she inserted it. Click. The sound felt strangely loud. Sarah froze. Because after all these years, the door was finally unlocked. Slowly, she pushed it open. The room was covered in dust. Sunlight entered through old curtains. Tiny particles floated through the air. At first, it looked ordinary. Old furniture, boxes, bookshelves, photographs. Nothing shocking, nothing mysterious. Sarah almost laughed. Seriously? She whispered. This is what everyone was hiding? Then something caught her attention. Near the far wall, under a white sheet, was a small wooden chest. Unlike everything else, it looked clean. Too clean. No dust. No age. As if someone had touched it recently. Sarah frowned. Slowly, she walked closer, and immediately noticed something strange. There was no lock. Only words carved into the top. Words that instantly made her heart stop. To the one brave enough to know the truth. Sarah stared. Because suddenly, this didn't feel like forgotten storage anymore. This felt intentional. Very intentional. Slowly she lifted the lid. Inside were old photographs, letters, documents, and one black envelope. Her hands began shaking. Because written across the front, in faded handwriting, were 6 words. The truth about your grandfather. Sarah stopped breathing. because suddenly she realized something terrifying. Maybe the secret buried for 40 years wasn't about a room. Maybe it was about a person. Sarah stared at the black envelope. Her fingers felt cold. The truth about your grandfather. The words didn't make sense, because Sarah knew her grandfather, or at least, she thought she did. Everyone did. Richard Carter, hard-working, quiet, respected. The kind of man people described with simple words. A good husband, a good father, a good man. Sarah grew up hearing those words, over and over. So why hide an envelope? Why lock a room? Why wait 40 years? Slowly, she opened it. Inside was a stack of papers, old letters, photographs, and a birth certificate. Sarah frowned. A birth certificate. She unfolded it carefully, then froze. Because under father's name was a name she had never heard before. Not Richard Carter. Someone else. Sarah blinked, looked again. No, she had to be reading it wrong. But the name didn't change. Her breathing slowed, because underneath the certificate was an old photograph. Black and white, edges worn with age. In the picture stood a young woman holding a baby. Standing beside her was a man Sarah had never seen before. Except, she had. Somehow she had. She looked closer, then suddenly remembered. Her heart dropped, because she had seen that face before, not in old family albums. Not inside the house, on her grandfather's desk, years ago, inside a frame that always faced downward. As a child, she once picked it up, just once, and her grandmother immediately took it away. Don't touch that. Sarah remembered those exact words. At the time, she thought nothing of it. Now, everything felt different. With shaking hands, she reached for another letter. The paper looked fragile, yellow with age. Slowly, she unfolded it and read the first sentence. Richard was never supposed to know the truth. Sarah immediately froze, because suddenly, 40 years of silence started feeling much heavier, because this wasn't just a secret anymore. This was a lie that had lived inside the family for generations. Sarah stared at the letter, then read the first line again. Richard was never supposed to know the truth. Her heart was beating harder now, because suddenly, this didn't feel like family history anymore. It felt personal, very personal. Slowly, she continued reading. If you are reading this, then the truth finally found its way out. And maybe, it's time. Sarah swallowed hard, because underneath was a name. Margaret Ellis. She frowned. Margaret? She had never heard that name before. Not once. Then she continued reading. 43 years ago, I made a decision that changed several lives. Sarah leaned forward. I was young. I was scared. And I thought I was protecting everyone. Protecting everyone? Sarah kept reading. Richard loved Evelyn deeply. But before Richard met Evelyn, there was someone else. Sarah froze. Someone else. And when that relationship ended, there was something Richard never knew. Her chest tightened. No. Because suddenly, a thought entered her mind. A thought she didn't want to think. But she couldn't stop it. Slowly, she looked back at the photograph. The young woman. The baby. The unknown man. Then back at the letter. Her eyes moved to the next line. And suddenly, everything around her felt silent. Richard had a son. Sarah stopped breathing. A son? Her grandfather had a son? No, that couldn't be possible. Nobody knew. Nobody ever said anything. Richard and Evelyn had only one daughter, Sarah's mother. At least, that's what everyone believed. With shaking hands, she turned over the photograph. And written on the back were words that instantly sent chills through her body. Daniel, age 2. Daniel. Not Richard, not Evelyn. Daniel. Sarah stared at the name, because suddenly, 40 years of silence started making sense. Not completely, but enough to know something. The family wasn't hiding a mistake. They were hiding a person. And somewhere, after all these years, that person might still be alive. Then Sarah noticed one final thing inside the box. a folded piece of paper, an address, and underneath it, 4 words: "Find him before it's late." Sarah stared at the address. Her eyes moved over it again and again, because suddenly, the secret wasn't sitting inside a box anymore. It had an address, a street, a place, a real person. Sarah looked out the dusty window. The sun had started setting. Orange light stretched across the room. Part of her wanted to stop. Close the chest. Put everything back. Pretend none of this ever happened. Because some truths feel easier unopened. But then she remembered her grandmother's note. Open it now. Not later. Not someday. Now. 3 hours later, Sarah pulled into a small, quiet town she had never visited before. Narrow streets, small houses, old trees, children playing in front yards. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Because Sarah's heart definitely wasn't. House number 117. She parked slowly. Looked up. White walls. Blue mailbox. Small garden in front. Simple. She sat in her car staring at the house. Because what exactly was she supposed to say? Hi, I think you might secretly be part of my family. No, that sounded ridiculous. For several seconds, she almost turned the key and drove away. Almost. But instead, she took a deep breath, opened the door, and walked toward the house. Her footsteps felt heavier with every step. Then finally, she knocked. Nothing. A few seconds passed. Still nothing. Sarah looked down. Maybe nobody was home. Then suddenly, footsteps. Slow footsteps. The door slowly opened. An older man stood there. Gray hair, gentle eyes, a tired face, and Sarah instantly froze. Because she wasn't looking at a stranger. She was looking at her grandfather. Not exactly, but close enough to make her heart stop. Same eyes, same smile, same jawline. Even the way he tilted his head looked familiar. The man frowned slightly. "Can I help you?" he asked politely. Sarah couldn't speak, because suddenly 40 years of buried truth was standing directly in front of her. Her eyes slowly filled with tears. Then the man looked down, at the photograph in her shaking hands. His entire expression changed, immediately. The color disappeared from his face, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Where did you get that?" Sarah couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly. The man kept staring at the photograph. His hands slowly began shaking. "Where did you get that?" he asked again. Sarah swallowed hard. "My grandmother's house." Silence. Complete silence. Then something unexpected happened. The man sat down immediately, as if his legs suddenly lost strength. His eyes never left the picture. For several long seconds, he just stared. Then finally, he whispered something. Something Sarah almost didn't hear. "Richard." Sarah's heartbeat stopped. Because suddenly, this wasn't a possibility anymore. This wasn't a theory. This was real. Slowly, she sat across from him. "My name is Sarah," she said softly. "And Richard," she hesitated, "was my grandfather." The man closed his eyes, immediately, as if 40 years of memories had suddenly returned all at once. Then Sarah noticed tears forming. Not small tears. Real tears. The kind people cry when pain has been waiting too long. Finally, he looked at her. "My name is Daniel." Sarah froze. "Daniel." The same name written behind the photograph. No, no way. Then he smiled sadly. "I spent my whole life wondering if Richard knew I existed." Sarah felt her chest tighten. Her whole life, she thought she came looking for answers. But now she realized something. This man had been waiting for answers too. For decades. Daniel looked toward the window. "When I was younger," he said quietly, "my mother told me my father never wanted us." Sarah frowned. But years later, before she died, she admitted something. Sarah leaned forward. Daniel's eyes filled again. She never told him. Sarah stared. Richard never left. Richard never abandoned anyone. Richard never knew. 40 years. 40 years of distance. 40 years of questions. 40 years of pain. All because of one hidden truth. Then Daniel slowly stood, walked toward a small drawer, and pulled something out. A letter. Old. Folded. Unopened. Then he looked at Sarah and whispered, "I wrote this to Richard 20 years ago. I just never sent it." Daniel stared at the letter in his hands. For a moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, he handed it to Sarah. "I wrote it 20 years ago," he said softly. "I carried it everywhere." Sarah looked down. The edges were worn, folded hundreds of times, as if someone had opened it, closed it, and changed their mind over and over again. "Why didn't you send it?" she asked quietly. Daniel smiled, but it wasn't really a smile. "Because after waiting so long," he said, "I convinced myself it didn't matter anymore." Silence filled the room. Sarah slowly unfolded the letter. The handwriting was careful, almost nervous. "Dear Richard, you don't know me. Or maybe you do. Honestly, I've spent my entire life wondering that myself." Sarah swallowed hard. "I used to imagine what I would say if we ever met. I used to imagine what kind of man you were. I wondered if I had your eyes, or your laugh, or if you ever thought about me." Daniel looked away, toward the window, because he already knew what came next. But Sarah kept reading. "I spent years being angry, years believing I wasn't wanted. But anger becomes heavy after a while. Eventually, I stopped wanting answers. I just wanted peace." Sarah felt tears filling her eyes. Then she reached the final lines, and suddenly, her breathing stopped. "If none of this was your choice, then I hope you had a good life. And if you ever wanted to know me, I would have wanted that too. Your son, Daniel." Silence. Daniel wiped his eyes. "So," he whispered, "I guess now I finally know." Sarah looked at him, confused. Daniel smiled sadly. "Richard didn't abandon me. He never knew." Sarah couldn't speak. Because suddenly, 40 years of pain, 40 years of confusion, 40 years of distance, collapsed in a single moment. Not because of hatred, not because of betrayal, because of silence. Weeks later, Sarah shared everything with her family. The letters, the photographs, the truth. People cried, people apologized, people sat in silence. But for the first time in decades, nobody changed the subject. Nobody avoided the past. Because the secret that had lived in darkness for 40 years finally had a voice. Moral of the story: the truth doesn't disappear just because we bury it. Silence can survive for years, and sometimes even generations. But pain passed down in silence becomes pain repeated. Sometimes the greatest gift we can leave people is honesty, even when the truth is difficult. If you discovered a family secret that changed everything, would you want to know the full truth? And tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes it's amazing to see how people from different places connect through the same emotions. And subscribe for more emotional stories that stay with you long after they end.